In this video, I will read Flannery O'Connor's short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, and I will pause now and then to comment on the narrative, ideally so that you can enjoy the story even more. A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor. The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee, and she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. He was sitting on the edge of his chair at the table, bent over the orange sports section of the journal. "Now look here, Bailey," she said. "See here, read this." And she stood with one hand on her thin hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. "Here is this fellow that calls himself the Misfit as a loose from the federal pen and headed toward Florida. If you read here what it says he did to these people, just you read it. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that a loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did." Bailey didn't look up from his reading, so she wheeled around and faced the children's mother, a young woman in slacks whose face was as broad and innocent as a cabbage, and was tied around with a green headkerchief that had 2 points in the top, just like a rabbit's ears. She was sitting on the sofa, feeding the baby his apricots out of a jar. "The children have never been to Florida before," the old lady said. "You all ought to take them somewhere else for a change, so they would see different parts of the world and be broad. They never have been to East Tennessee." The children's mother didn't seem to hear her, but the 8-year-old boy, John Wesley, a stocky child with glasses, said, "If you don't want to go to Florida, why don't you stay at home?" He and the little girl, June Starr, were reading funny papers on the floor. "She wouldn't stay at home to be queen for a day," June Starr said, without raising her yellow head. "Yes, and what would you do if this fellow the Misfit caught you?" the grandmother asked. "I'd smack his face," John Wesley said. "She wouldn't stay at home for $1 million, June Starr said, afraid she'd miss something. She has to go everywhere we go." "All right, miss," the grandmother said. "Just remember that the next time that you want me to curl your hair." June Starr said that her hair was naturally curly. In the opening paragraphs of the story, we are introduced to the family. The grandmother is the central character, and we see her place in the family. Her son Bailey and the children's mother ignore her, and the children don't respect her, and the parents do nothing about that. Now, before we feel too badly for the poor grandmother, O'Connor shows us early on that she's what we might call a piece of work. She's manipulative. She's dismissive of her daughter-in-law. Did you notice that the children's mother is referred to not by name, but by function? The children's mother. We can't entirely blame the family for being weary of this tiresome old lady, although the children could use a little more instruction on manners. So the family is more than a little dysfunctional, and not one of them comes off very well, except for maybe the baby. The next morning, the grandmother was the first one in the car ready to go. She had her big black valise that looked like the head of a hippopotamus in one corner, and underneath it she was hiding a basket with Pitty Sing, the cat, in it. She didn't intend for the cat to be left alone in the house for 3 days because he would miss her too much, and she was afraid he might brush against one of the gas burners and accidentally asphyxiate himself. Her son Bailey didn't like to arrive at a motel with a cat. She sat in the middle of the back seat with John Wesley and June Starr on either side of her. Bailey and the children's mother and the baby sat in front, and they left Atlanta at 8:45 with a mileage on the car at 55,890. The grandmother wrote this down because she thought it would be interesting to say how many miles they had been when they got back. It took them 20 minutes to reach the outskirts of the city. The old lady settled herself comfortably, removing her white cotton gloves and putting them up with her purse on the shelf in front of the back window. The children's mother still had on slacks and still had her head tied up in a green kerchief, but the grandmother had on a navy blue dress with a small white dot in the print. Her collars and cuffs were white organdy trimmed with lace, and at her neckline she had pinned a purple spray of cloth violets containing a sachet. In case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. We've got to stop and talk about O'Connor's fascinating narrators. We read, "She didn't intend for the cat to be left alone in the house for 3 days because he would miss her too much, and she was afraid that he might brush against one of the gas burners and accidentally asphyxiate himself." But it sounds like, "I don't intend for the cat to be left alone in the house for 3 days because he would miss me too much, and I am afraid he might brush up against one of the gas burners and accidentally asphyxiate himself." The fancy name for this is called free indirect discourse. It's when the narrator gets infected by or channels the character's point of view. The words are officially the narrator's, but the wording and sentiment are the characters. Examples abound. One of the early examples in this story is that the narrator refers to the daughter-in-law as the children's mother. Another example from the bit that we just read, the children's mother still had on slacks. Still? There's a lot of judgment in that word. And disinterested third-person narrators don't make judgments like that. This is the grandmother's attitude. These are the grandmother's thoughts. And the description of how she is dressed is in a similar vein. A narrator isn't all that interested in the details, but the grandmother certainly is. And why is she dressed this way? In case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. This is the grandmother's concern, not the narrator's. So about being judged when you're dead on the highway? This might sound strange to some people, but our mothers used to say stuff like this to us back in the day. Just as we were leaving the house for a full day of adventuring far and wide on a Saturday, they'd ask us if we had changed our underwear, in case you were in an accident. Apparently the first thing that the medical personnel do when attending to a kid who has just been hit by a car while riding their bike is check their underwear and judge whether they had a good mother. The grandmother, too, is worried about the judgment, about what people will think if they found her dead in a ditch along the highway. If it's important to her that she be thought of as a lady in death, it's certainly going to be a priority in her life. In the grandmother's mind, being a lady is connected to being good. She said she thought it was going to be a good day for driving, neither too hot nor too cold, and she cautioned Bailey that the speed limit was 55 miles an hour, and that the patrolmen hid themselves behind billboards and small clumps of trees and sped out after you before you had a chance to slow down. She pointed out interesting details of the scenery. Stone Mountain, the blue granite that in some places came up to both sides of the highway, the brilliant red clay banks slightly streaked with purple, and the various crops that made rows of green lacework on the ground. The trees were full of silver-white sunlight, and the meanest of them sparkled. The children were reading comic magazines, and their mother had gone back to sleep. This paragraph shows that the grandmother hasn't stopped talking since they left home. If it hasn't become clear yet, the grandmother is a flawed character, and she's annoying to those around her. This paragraph is designed to put you into the shoes of the family who's trapped in the car with this lady for hours on end.
Let's go through Georgia fast so we won't have to look at it much, John Wesley said. If I were a little boy, said the grandmother, I wouldn't talk about my native state that way. Tennessee has the mountains and Georgia has the hills. Tennessee is just a hillbilly dumping ground, John Wesley said, and Georgia is a lousy state too. You said it, June Star said. In my time, said the grandmother, folding her thin-veined fingers, children were more respectful of their native states, and their parents and everything else. People did right then. Oh, look at that cute little pickaninny, she said, and pointed to a Negro child standing in the door of a shack. Wouldn't that make a picture now? She asked, and they all turned around and looked at the little Negro out of the back window. He waved. He didn't have any breeches on, June Star said. He probably didn't have any, the grandmother explained. Little niggers in the country don't have things like we do. If I could paint, I'd paint that picture, she said. The children exchanged comic books.
The grandmother is sentimental. A sentimental person indulges in the excessive expression of feelings of tenderness or sadness or nostalgia. A character suffering from sentimentalism is blind to the harsh realities of life. They always sugarcoat everything. O'Connor doesn't cotton to sentimentalism, and this comes out in many of her stories. This one included. The grandmother is sentimental about a lot of things, including her native state. But then they drive past this little boy. A pickaninny is a derogatory term for a child of African descent. This child is so poor that he's wearing no pants. And what does the grandmother want to do? Paint a picture of it. She's sentimentalizing the whole scene, ignoring the poverty and the social and economic systems that perpetuate it. The grandmother's connection to other people, to humanity, is atrophied. She has no capacity to see suffering or to care about it. Add to that, she's completely unaware of this deficiency in her character. She has no need to change. She's good. A way back, we had a not-so-subtle reference to death, when the grandmother narrator was talking about being dead on the highway and being considered a lady. Well, in the next paragraph, we have another more subtle reference to death, and this won't be the last one, so don't miss them.
The grandmother offered to hold the baby, and the children's mother passed him over the front seat to her. She set him on her knee and bounced him and told him about the things that they were passing. She rolled her eyes and screwed up her mouth and stuck her leathery thin face into his smooth, bland one. Occasionally he gave her a faraway smile. They passed a large cotton field with 5 or 6 graves fenced in the middle of it, like a small island. Look at that graveyard, the grandmother said, pointing it out. That was the old family burying ground. That belonged to the plantation. Where's the plantation? John Wesley asked. Gone with the wind, said the grandmother. Ha ha. When the children finished all the comic books they brought, they opened the lunch and ate it. The grandmother ate a peanut butter sandwich and an olive, and would not let the children throw the box and the paper napkins out the window. When there was nothing else to do, they played a game by choosing a cloud and making the other two guess what shape it suggested. John Wesley took one the shape of a cow, and June Star guessed a cow. And John Wesley said no, an automobile. And June Star said he didn't play fair. And they began to slap each other over the grandmother. The grandmother said that she would tell them a story if they would keep quiet. When she told a story, she rolled her eyes and waved her head and was very dramatic. She said once when she was a maiden lady, she had been courted by a Mr. Edgar Atkins Teagarden from Jasper, Georgia. She said he was a very good-looking man and a gentleman, and that he brought her a watermelon every Saturday afternoon with his initials cut into it, E.A.T. Well, one Saturday, she said, Mr. Teagarden brought the watermelon and there was nobody at home, and he left it on the front porch and returned in his buggy to Jasper. But she never got the watermelon, she said, because an boy ate it when he saw the initials E.A.T. This story tickled John Wesley's funny bone, and he giggled and giggled, but June Star didn't think it was any good. She said that she wouldn't marry a man that just brought her a watermelon on Saturday, and the grandmother said that she would have done well to marry Mr. Teagarden, because he was a gentleman, and he had bought Coca-Cola stock when it first came out, and that he had died only a few years ago, a very wealthy man. They stopped at the tower for barbecue sandwiches. The tower was a part stucco and part wood filling station and dance hall set in a clearing outside of Timothy. A fat man named Red Sammy Butts ran it, and there were signs stuck here and there on the buildings for miles up and down the highway saying, "Try Red Sammy's famous barbecue. None like famous Red Sammy's. Red Sam, the fat boy with a happy laugh. A veteran. Red Sammy's your man." Red Sammy was lying out on the bare ground outside the tower with his head under a truck, while a gray monkey about a foot high, chained to a small chinaberry tree, chattered nearby. The monkey sprang back into the tree and got on the highest limb as soon as he saw the children jump out of the car and run toward him. Inside the tower was a long dark room with a counter at one end and the tables at the other, and a dancing space in the middle. They all sat down at a broad table next to the Nickelodeon, and Red Sam's wife, a tall burnt brown woman with hair and eyes lighter than her skin, came and took their order. The children's mother put a dime in the machine and played the Tennessee Waltz, and the grandmother said that the tune always made her want to dance. She asked Bailey if he would like to dance, but he only glared at her. He didn't have a naturally sunny disposition like she did, and trips made him nervous. The grandmother's brown eyes were very bright. She swayed her head from side to side and pretended that she was dancing in her chair. June Star said play something fast so she could tap to it, so the children's mother put another dime and played a fast number, and June Star stepped out onto the dance floor and did her tap routine. "Ain't she cute?" Red Sammy's wife said, leaning over the counter. "Would you like to come and be my little girl?" "No, I certainly wouldn't," June Star said. "I wouldn't live in a broken-down place like this for $1,000,000. And she ran back to the table. "Ain't she cute?" the woman repeated, stretching her mouth politely. "Aren't you ashamed?" hissed the grandmother. Red Sam came in and told his wife to quit lounging on the counter and hurry up with these people's order. His khaki trousers reached just to his hip bones, and his stomach hung over them like a sack of meal swaying under his shirt. He came over and sat down at a table nearby and let out a combination sigh and yodel. "You can't win," he said. "You can't win." And he wiped his sweating red face off with a gray handkerchief. "These days you don't know who to trust," he said. "Ain't that the truth?" "People are certainly not as nice as they used to be," said the grandmother. "Two fellers came in here last week," Red Sammy said, "driving a Chrysler. It was an old beat-up car, but it was a good one. And these boys looked all right to me. Said they worked at the mill. And you know I let them fellers charge the gas they bought. Now why did I do that?" "Because you're a good man," the grandmother said at once. "Is'm? I suppose so," Red Sam said, as if he were struck with this answer. His wife brought the orders, carrying the 5 plates all at once without a tray, 2 in each hand and 1 balanced on her arm. "It isn't a soul in this green world of God's that you can trust," she said. "And I don't count nobody out of that. Not nobody," she repeated, looking at Red Sammy. "Did you read about that criminal, the Misfit, that's escaped?" asked the grandmother. "I wouldn't be a bit surprised if he didn't attack this place right here," said the woman. "If he hears about it being here, I wouldn't be none surprised to see him. If he hears it's 2 cents in the cash register, I wouldn't be tall surprised if he—" "That'll do," Red Sam said. "Go bring these people their Coca-Colas." And the woman went off to get the rest of their order. "A good man is hard to find," Red Sammy said. "Everything is getting terrible. I remember the day you could go off and leave your screen door unlatched. Not no more."
Red Sam says it. A good man is hard to find. But the grandmother has just called Red Sammy a good man. Is he? I mean, he's not terrible, I suppose. But does he really fit into the category of good man? In just a few lines, it's pretty clear that he's more like an ordinary man, with a few qualities that disqualify him from the category of being good. Both Red Sammy and the grandmother have a sentimental view of the past. They go on to discuss the past through their rose-colored glasses.
He and the grandmother discussed better times. The old lady said that in her opinion, Europe was entirely to blame for the way things were now. She said that the way Europe acted, you would think that they were made of money. And Red Sammy said it was no use talking about it. She was exactly right. The children ran outside into the white sunlight and looked at the monkey in the lacy chinaberry tree. He was busy catching fleas on himself and biting each one carefully between his teeth, as if it were a delicacy. They drove off again into the hot afternoon. The grandmother took cat naps and woke up every few minutes with her own snoring. Outside of Toomsboro, she woke up and recalled the old plantation that she had visited in this neighborhood once when she was a young lady. She said the house had 6 white columns across the front and that there was an avenue of oaks leading up to it, and 2 little wooden trellis arbors on either side in front of where you sat down with your suitor after a stroll in the garden. She recalled exactly which road to turn off to get to it. She knew that Bailey would not be willing to lose any time looking at an old house. But the more she talked about it, the more she wanted to see it once again, and find out if the little twin arbors were still standing. There was a secret panel in this house, she said craftily, not telling the truth but wishing that she were. And the story went that the family silver was hidden in it when Sherman came through, but it was never found. "Hey," John Wesley said, "let's go see it. We'll find it. We'll poke all the woodwork and find it. Who lives there? Where do you turn off at? Hey, Pop, can't we turn off there?" "We never have seen a house with a secret panel," June Star shrieked. "Let's go to the house with a secret panel. Hey, Pop, can't we go see the house with the secret panel?" "It's not far from here, I know," the grandmother said. "It wouldn't take over 20 minutes. Bailey was looking straight ahead. His jaw was as rigid as a horseshoe. "No," he said. The children began to yell and scream that they wanted to see the house with the secret panel. John Wesley kicked the back of the front seat, and June Star was hung over her mother's shoulder and whined desperately into her ear that they never had any fun, even on their vacation. That they could never do what they wanted to do. The baby began to scream, and John Wesley kicked the back of the seat so hard that his father could feel the blows in his kidney. "All right," he shouted, and he drew the car to a stop at the side of the road. "Will you all shut up? Will you all just shut up for 1 second? If you don't shut up, we won't go anywhere." "It would be very educational for them," the grandmother murmured. "All right," said Bailey, "but get this. This is the only time we are going to stop for anything like this. This is the one and only time. The dirt road that you have to turn down is about a mile back," the grandmother directed. "I marked it when we passed." "A dirt road," Bailey groaned.
Did you notice that they were outside Toomsboro when the grandmother remembered the plantation? Anyway, I love the grandmother. Or I suppose I mean, I love how O'Connor writes about the grandmother, especially that part where she talks about Europe being entirely to blame for the way things are, and about the way Europe acted. The first few times I read this passage out loud to my class, I had tears running from my eyes. I was laughing so hard. O'Connor totally understands her protagonist. The grandmother has no power in the family. They don't really take what she wants into account at all. So we saw from the very first page that she uses manipulation to get her way. Here she does it again. She weaponizes the children.
After they had turned around and were heading toward the dirt road, the grandmother recalled other points about the house. The beautiful glass over the front doorway, and the candle lamp in the hall. John Wesley said that the secret panel was probably in the fireplace. "You can't go inside this house," Bailey said. "You don't know who lives there." "While you all talk to the people in front, I'll run around behind and get in a window," John Wesley suggested. "We'll all stay in the car," his mother said. They turned onto the dirt road, and the car raced roughly along in a swirl of pink dust. The grandmother recalled the times when there were no paved roads and 30 miles were a day's journey. The dirt road was hilly, and there were sudden washes in it, and sharp curves on dangerous embankments. All at once they would be on a hill, looking down over the blue tops of trees for miles around. Then the next minute, they would be in a red depression, with dust-coated trees looking down on them. "This place had better turn up in a minute," Bailey said, "or I'm going to turn around." The road looked as if no one had traveled on it in months. "It's not much farther," the grandmother said, and just as she said it, a horrible thought came to her. The thought was so embarrassing that she turned red in the face, and her eyes dilated, and her feet jumped up, upsetting her valise in the corner. The instant the valise moved, the newspaper top she had over the basket, under it rose a snarl, and Pitty Sing the cat sprang onto Bailey's shoulder. The children were thrown to the floor, and their mother, clutching the baby, was thrown out the door onto the ground. The old lady was thrown into the front seat. The car turned over once and landed right side up in a gulch off the side of the road. Bailey remained in the driver's seat with the cat, gray-striped with a broad white face and an orange nose, clinging to his neck like a caterpillar.
This is classic Flannery O'Connor. The way she writes about this car crash, it's so abrupt and matter-of-fact that you are halfway into the sentence before you know that she's describing a crash. If this story were a movie, you'd have all kinds of sound effects and music and special effects, and these would all complement this event. But O'Connor's prose doesn't do that. And then there's the beautiful blend of the comedic with the tragic.
As soon as the children saw that they could move their arms and legs, they scrambled out of the car, shouting, "We had an accident!" The grandmother was curled up under the dashboard, hoping that she was injured so that Bailey's wrath would not come down on her all at once. The horrible thought she had before the accident was that the house she had remembered so vividly was not in Georgia, but in Tennessee. Bailey removed the cat from his neck with both hands and flung it out the window against the side of a pine tree. Then he got out of the car and started looking for the children's mother. She was sitting against the side of the red-gutted ditch, holding the screaming baby, but she only had a cut down her face and a broken shoulder. "We've had an accident!" The children screamed in a frenzy of delight. "But nobody's killed," June Star said with disappointment as the grandmother limped out of the car. Her hat still pinned to her head, but the broken front brim standing up at a jaunty angle, and the violet spray hanging off the side. They all sat down in the ditch, except the children, to recover from the shock. They were all shaking.
The grandmother was proud of her outfit. It was an external presentation about how she wanted to be thought of by the world. And if we came upon her dead on the highway, we might have been taken in by her costume. But at this point in the narrative, we know her a little better. She's a manipulative, superficial, sentimental, prattling old lady. After her error, which caused the accident, her carefully constructed outfit is breaking down.
"Maybe a car will come along," said the children's mother hoarsely. "I believe I have injured an organ," said the grandmother, pressing her side, but no one answered her. Bailey's teeth were clattering. He had on a yellow sports shirt with bright blue parrots designed in it, and his face was as yellow as the shirt. The grandmother decided that she would not mention that the house was in Tennessee. The road was about 10 feet above, and they could see only the tops of the trees on the other side of it. Behind the ditch they were sitting in were more woods, tall and dark and deep. In a few minutes they saw a car some distance away on the top of a hill, coming slowly as if the occupants were watching them. The grandmother stood up and waved both arms dramatically to attract their attention. The car continued to come on slowly, disappeared around a bend, and appeared again, moving even slower on top of the hill they had gone over. It was a big, black, battered, hearse-like automobile. There were 3 men in it. It came to a stop just over them, and for some minutes the driver looked down with a steady, expressionless gaze to where they were sitting and didn't speak. Then he turned his head and muttered something to the other two, and they got out. One was a fat boy in black trousers and a red sweatshirt with a silver stallion embossed on the front of it. He moved around on the right side of them and stood staring, his mouth partly open in a kind of loose grin. The other had on khaki pants and a blue striped coat, and a gray hat pulled down very low, hiding most of his face. He came around slowly on the left side. Neither spoke. The driver got out of the car and stood by the side of it, looking down at them. He was an older man than the other two. His hair was just beginning to gray, and he wore silver-rimmed spectacles that gave him a scholarly look. He had a long creased face and didn't have on any shirt or undershirt. He had on blue jeans that were too tight for him and was holding a black hat and a gun. The 2 boys also had guns.
Now look at this description of the 3 men. It talks about their hair coloring and their pants and shirts and what they have on their heads. And then at the very end, it mentions almost in an offhand way that they all had guns. If you were there, this would be the first thing you'd notice. But authors are in complete control of what we see and when. The text says that the driver wore silver-rimmed spectacles that gave him a scholarly look. That the one in charge wears glasses is significant. We know this because it's mentioned several times in the rest of the story. As we will discover, he's quite rational. He doesn't accept things without proof. He's a big one for concrete evidence and collecting documentation. The glasses, then, are symbolic for the intellectual lenses through which he views the world.
"We've had an accident!" the children screamed. The grandmother had a peculiar feeling that the bespectacled man was someone she knew. His face was as familiar to her as if she had known him all her life, but she could not recall who he was. He moved away from the car and began to come down the embankment, placing his feet carefully so that he wouldn't slip. He had on tan and white shoes and no socks, and his ankles were red and thin. "Good afternoon," he said. "I see you had a little spill."
Sorry to interrupt again so soon, but we just had a line that we need to talk about. His face was as familiar to her as if she had known him all her life. When you come across a line like this, you need to consider that it might be something you could interpret literally, just for a moment, and then consider, if taken literally, who this might be.
"We turned over twice," said the grandmother. "Onct," he corrected. "We seen it happen. Try their car, see will it run, Hiram." he said quietly to the boy with the gray hat. What you got that gun for? John Wesley asked. What you gonna do with that gun? Lady, the man said to the children's mother, would you mind calling them children to sit by you? Children make me nervous. I want you all to sit down right together, there where you're at. What are you telling us what to do for? June Star asked. Behind them, the line of woods gaped like a dark open mouth. Come here, said their mother. Look here now, Bailey began suddenly. We're in a predicament. The grandmother shrieked. She scrambled to her feet and stood staring. You're the Misfit, she said. I recognized you at once. Yes'm, the man said, smiling slightly as if he were pleased in spite of himself to be known. But it would have been better for all of you, lady, if you hadn't recognized me. Bailey turned his head sharply and said something to his mother that shocked even the children. The old lady began to cry, and the Misfit reddened. Lady, he said, don't you get upset. Sometimes a man says things he don't mean. I don't reckon he meant to talk to you that-a-way. You wouldn't shoot a lady, would you? The grandmother said, and removed a clean handkerchief from her cuff, and she began to slap at her eyes with it. The Misfit pointed the toe of his shoe into the ground and made a little hole, and then covered it up again. I would hate to have to, he said. Listen, the grandmother almost screamed. I know you're a good man. You don't look a bit like you have common blood. I know you must come from nice people. Yes'm, he said, finest people in the world. When he smiled, he showed a row of strong white teeth. God never made a finer woman than my mother, and my daddy's heart was pure gold, he said. The boy with the red sweatshirt had come up behind them and was standing with his gun at his hip. The Misfit squatted down on the ground. Watch them children, Bobby Lee, he said. You know they make me nervous. He looked at the 6 of them huddled together in front of him, and he seemed to be embarrassed, as if he couldn't think of anything to say. Ain't a cloud in the sky, he remarked, looking up at it. Don't see no sun, but don't see no cloud neither. Yes, it's a beautiful day, said the grandmother. Listen, she said, you shouldn't call yourself the Misfit, because I know you're a good man at heart. I can just look at you and tell.
We see here how meaningful the phrase good man actually is to the grandmother. She calls the ordinary man Red Sammy a good man, but a mass murderer? Another thing, do you remember anyone who also had an aversion to children in this story? That monkey on the lacy chinaberry tree, over at the tower. So what's the deal with that? We need to take repetition seriously in all short stories. Twice now the Misfit has said that the children make him nervous. Is O'Connor suggesting that the Misfit, despite his scholarly approach, maybe because of it, has a very limited perspective on reality? Something approaching a monkey's perspective? And one more thing, the setting is getting involved in this story. This is often the case in Flannery O'Connor short stories. I don't know if you noticed it before, but we read, behind them the line of the woods gaped like a dark open mouth. This is, of course, personification or metaphor depending on how you think of it. The effect is that something or someone is going to be eaten. The woods are hungry. And now we have the lines, ain't a cloud in the sky, he remarked, looking up at it. Don't see no sun, but don't see no cloud neither. This would likely be just a literal description of the weather, but this is not the last time that we will hear about the cloudless sky. It's that repetition thing again. Signals of significance.
Hush, Bailey yelled. Hush, everybody shut up, and let me handle this. He was squatting in the position of a runner about to sprint forward, but he didn't move. I appreciate that, lady, the Misfit said, and he drew a little circle in the ground with the butt of his gun. It'll take half an hour to fix this here car, Hiram called, looking over the raised hood of it. Well, first you and Bobby Lee get him and that little boy to step over yonder with you, the Misfit said, pointing to Bailey and John Wesley. The boys want to ask you something, he said to Bailey. Would you mind stepping back in them woods with them? Listen, Bailey began. We're in a terrible predicament. Nobody realizes what this is. And his voice cracked. His eyes were as blue and intense as the parrots in his shirt, and he remained perfectly still. The grandmother reached up to adjust her hat brim as if she were going into the woods with him, but it came off in her hand. She stood staring at it, and after a second she let it fall to the ground. Hiram pulled Bailey up by the arm as if he were assisting an old man. John Wesley caught hold of his father's hand and Bobby Lee followed. They went off toward the woods, and just as they reached the dark edge, Bailey turned and supporting himself against the gray-naked pine trunk, he shouted, I'll be back in a minute, Mama. Wait on me. Come back this instant, his mother shrilled, but they all disappeared into the woods. Bailey boy, the grandmother called in a tragic voice, but she found she was looking at the Misfit, squatting on the ground in front of her. I just know you're a good man, she said desperately. You're not a bit common. No'm, I ain't a good man, the Misfit said after a second, as if he considered her statement carefully. But I ain't the worst in the world neither. My daddy said I was a different breed of dog from my brothers and sisters. You know, Daddy said, it's some that can live their whole life without asking about it, and it's others that has to know why it is. And this boy is one of the latters. He's going to be into everything. He put on his black hat and looked up suddenly, and then away deep into the woods, as if he were embarrassed again. "I'm sorry I don't have a shirt on before you ladies," he said, hunching his shoulders slightly. "We buried our clothes that we had on when we escaped, and we were just making do until we can get better. We borrowed these from some folks we met," he explained. "That's perfectly all right," said the grandmother. "Maybe Bailey has an extra shirt in his suitcase." "I'll look and see directly," the misfit said. "Where are you taking him?" the children's mother screamed. "Daddy was a card himself," the misfit said. "You couldn't put anything over on him. He never got in trouble with the authorities, though. Just had a knack of handling them." "You could be honest, too, if you'd only try," said the grandmother. "Think how wonderful it would be to settle down and live a comfortable life and not have to think about somebody chasing you all the time." The misfit kept scratching the ground with the butt of his gun as if he were thinking about it. "Yes'm, somebody's always after you," he murmured. The grandmother noticed how thin his shoulder blades were just behind his hat because she was standing up, looking down on him. "Do you ever pray?" she asked. He shook his head. All she saw was the black hat wiggle between his shoulder blades. "No," he said. There was a pistol shot from the woods, followed closely by another. Then silence. The old lady's head jerked around. She could hear the wind move through the tops of the trees like a long, satisfied insuck of breath. "Bailey boy," she called.
Yes, what you think happened, just happened. Again, that O'Connor style. It's so understated. 2 people were just shot, and we are back to the personification of the woods. Its hunger has begun to be sated. More than once, the misfit is said to be digging or making marks in the earth. Twice in this passage that we just read. Because it's repeated, we need to ask ourselves what it means. I don't know. Well, I'm not certain, but I do have a theory. In John 8, 1-11, we find the story of the woman caught in adultery. A group of scribes and Pharisees drag this woman before Jesus, and they ask him if they should stone her, as was prescribed by the law of Moses. Now they're doing this to test Jesus to see if he's going to contradict the law. Instead of answering them directly, Jesus bends down and writes on the ground with his finger. And then he says, "Let him who is without sin among you cast the first stone." So these religious dudes have no response to this and they kind of wander off. There's no one left to condemn her. I wonder if O'Connor, by having the misfit making marks in the dirt, is sending her readers a message about hypocrisy and to be careful with the way we look at the misfit or the grandmother. They're sinners just like we are. But let's go back a little. We have a second mention of the yellow shirt with blue parrots. Repetition. The grandmother's hat is falling apart. The false front that she puts on in the beginning of the trip is deteriorating. These 2 things are pointing forward to the final scenes. The grandmother's values are falling away, and the misfit is wearing the shirt that Bailey wore. These are symbolic foreshadowings. The grandmother calls the misfit a good man again, and this time he pushes back. He's not like the grandmother, spewing sentimentalism. He thinks deeply on things. He doesn't toss terms about so freely. There's a good reason why the grandmother calls the misfit a good man. It's because he has such good manners. She values manners a lot. It's another really important part of her sentimentality. She values it in herself and she values it in others. It is the standard by which she determines if a person is a good person or not. People often do this kind of thing. We have these arbitrary standards by which we judge other people, and Christians do this too. O'Connor shows the absurdity of the grandmother's standards by the fact that the man who just murdered her son and grandson sort of fits into her standard of goodness. He's modest and he apologizes for not wearing a shirt. All his words and manners show that he's polite to his victims. He's generous in his understanding, and he's respectful of his parents. There's more of her sentimentalizing when she says, "You could be honest too if you'd only try," said the grandmother. "Think of how wonderful it would be to settle down and live a comfortable life and not have to think about somebody chasing you all the time." This is a pretty simplistic and sentimental view on how evil and the justice system works. But perhaps she's just grasping at straws at this point. "I was a gospel singer for a while," the misfit said. "I've been most everything. Been in the armed service, both land and sea, at home and abroad. Been twice married. Been an undertaker. Been with the railroads, plowed Mother Earth. Been in a tornado. And seen a man burnt alive once." And looked up at the children's mother and the little girl who were sitting close together, their faces white and their eyes glassy. "I even seen a woman flogged," he said. "Pray, pray," the grandmother began. "Pray, pray." "I never was a bad boy that I remember of," the misfit said in an almost dreamy voice. "But somewheres along the line I done something wrong and I got sent to the penitentiary. I was buried alive." And he looked up and held her attention to him by a steady stare. "That's when you should have started to pray," she said. "What did you do to get sent to the penitentiary that first time?" "Turn to the right, it was a wall," the misfit said, looking up again at the cloudless sky. "Turn to the left, it was a wall. Look up, it was a ceiling. Look down, it was a floor. I forget what I done, lady.
I set there trying to remember what it was I done, but I ain't recalled it to this day. Once in a while I would think it was coming to me, but it never come. Maybe they put you in by mistake, the old lady said vaguely. No, he said. It wasn't no mistake. They had the papers on me. You must have stolen something, she said. The misfit sneered slightly. Nobody had nothing I wanted, he said. It was a head doctor at the penitentiary said what I done was kill my daddy, but I know that for a lie. My daddy died in 1919 of the flu epidemic, and I never had a thing to do with it. He was buried in the Mount Hopewell Baptist churchyard, and you can go there and see for yourself.
It's interesting that the misfit doesn't remember why he was sent to prison that first time. I think the vagaries of his first crime are deliberate. O'Connor is emphasizing the human condition. We are all fallen in sin. Sure, we all remember particular bad things we've done, but these don't condemn us in the first place. We aren't condemned for our cumulative sins, but for our condition, that of being in a state of rebellion against God. Many today hold the sentimental idea that it's our environment that makes us do bad things. And if we make everyone's childhood be good, or provide basic education, or enough social programs, then none of us would do bad things anymore. It's a sentimental pipe dream that we are ever going to get rid of evil. The misfit thinks that he had a great childhood and that his parents were awesome. Still, he murdered somebody, some sort of father figure. A psychiatrist diagnosed him as acting out of an Oedipus complex. Now for the grandmother, what's her answer to all this evil? She says over and over again that he should pray, or that he should have prayed. And then she says the word pray 4 times in a row, to the point that it's just meaningless. Prayer is a good thing, and it might have turned the misfit's life in a different direction. But I don't think this is what the grandmother is saying. She's lacquering the whole situation with a superficial Christian response. This is what Christians do. When you're going through a rough time, they will come up and tell you to pray. And they'll remind you that God works everything out for the good. And all this is true, but it's just not helpful. Because it's quick and it's simple and it's superficial. It's sentimental. In the next lines of the story, we will see that the grandmother continues with her sentimentalist views on prayer. She says, if you would pray, Jesus would help you. Interestingly, the misfit concedes this point, but he wants to do it on his own. This is the first sin, isn't it? Adam and Eve basically decided that they wanted to do it all on their own. And it's been a part of the human condition ever since.
If you would pray, the old lady said, Jesus would help you. That's right, the misfit said. Well, then why don't you pray? She asked, trembling with delight suddenly. I don't want no help, he said. I'm doing all right by myself. Bobby Lee and Hiram came ambling back from the woods. Bobby Lee was dragging a yellow shirt with bright blue parrots in it. Throw me that shirt, Bobby Lee, the misfit said. The shirt came flying at him and landed on his shoulder, and he put it on. The grandmother couldn't name what the shirt reminded her of. No, lady, the misfit said while he was buttoning it up. I found out the crime don't matter. You can do one thing or you can do another. Kill a man or take a tire off his car, because sooner or later you're going to forget what it was you'd done and just get punished for it. The children's mother had begun to make heaving noises, as if she couldn't get her breath. Lady, he asked, would you and that little girl like to step off yonder with Bobby Lee and Hiram and join your husband? Yes, thank you, the mother said faintly. Her left arm dangled helplessly, and she was holding the baby who had gone to sleep in the other. Help that lady up, Hiram, the misfit said as she struggled to climb out of the ditch. And Bobby Lee, you hold on to that little girl's hand. I don't want to hold hands with him, June Star said. He reminds me of a pig. The fat boy blushed and laughed and caught her by the arm and pulled her off into the woods after Hiram and her mother. Alone with the misfit, the grandmother found that she had lost her voice. There was not a cloud in the sky nor any sun. There was nothing around her but woods. She wanted to tell him that he must pray. She opened and closed her mouth several times before anything came out. Finally, she found herself saying, Jesus, Jesus, meaning Jesus will help you. But the way she was saying it, it sounded as if she might be cursing. Yes'm, the misfit said as if he agreed. Jesus thrown everything off balance. It was the same case with him as with me, except he hadn't committed any crime. And they could prove I had committed one because they had the papers on me. Of course, he said, they never shown me my papers. That's why I sign myself now. I said long ago, you get you a signature and sign everything you do and keep a copy of it. Then you'll know what you done, and you can hold up the crime to the punishment and see do they match. And in the end, you'll have something to prove. You ain't been treated right. I call myself the misfit, he said, because I can't make what all I done wrong fit what all I gone through in punishment. There was a piercing scream from the woods, followed closely by a pistol report.
Like we've been saying, the misfit is a deep thinker. So he's thought about crime and punishment. The misfit believes that the punishment should fit the crime. But Jesus threw everything off balance. He was innocent, but he was punished anyway. The Misfit believes that his punishment wasn't fair either, and that was because Jesus doesn't bring justice. He screws up justice, and he figures that he's received more punishment than he deserves. This is very different than the Christian idea that we stand condemned from the start because of our rebellious hearts, and that we can't save ourselves, not by being good, and not by paying the price for ourselves. These two strategies are embodied in these two characters. What they don't understand is that salvation, if we are to have it, comes from outside of ourselves, from Jesus, as a gift.
Does it seem right to you, lady, that one is punished a heap and another ain't punished at all? Jesus, the old lady cried, you've got good blood. I know you wouldn't shoot a lady. I know you come from nice people. Pray, Jesus, you ought not to shoot a lady. I'll give you all the money I've got. Lady, the Misfit said, looking beyond her far into the woods, there was never a body that give the undertaker a tip. There were 2 more pistol reports, and the grandmother raised her head like a parched old turkey hen crying for water and called, Bailey boy, as if her heart would break. Jesus was the only one that ever raised the dead, the Misfit continued, and he shouldn't have done it. He thrown everything off balance. If he did what he said, then it's nothing for you to do but throw away everything and follow him. And if he didn't, then it's nothing for you to do but enjoy the few minutes you got left the best way you can, by killing somebody or burning down his house or doing some other meanness to him. No pleasure but meanness, he said, and his voice had almost become a snarl.
This right here is exactly the situation that every person on the planet finds themselves in. It's the central question of life. What are we going to do with Jesus? It's interesting that O'Connor has the representative of evil doing all the theology in this story. As the modern skeptic, the Misfit is like doubting Thomas. He won't believe it unless he sees it personally. If Jesus actually did raise the dead, and if he did what he said, then nothing is the same in human history from that point forward. And if he didn't, then you can do whatever. For the Misfit, he decides to live for pleasure. And the only thing that gives him pleasure, he claims, is meanness. Not everyone who rejects Jesus is a murderer, but O'Connor offers this extreme to make the point that no one can really say that anyone is wrong about what they make to be their purpose in life, or what they call good and evil. Without an objective purpose or an objective moral standard, it's all up for grabs. Do what you enjoy. It's like Dostoevsky said, without God, all things are permitted. The answer to the question, what will you do with Jesus, is about to be asked of both of these characters.
Maybe he didn't raise the dead, the old lady mumbled, not knowing what she was saying, and feeling so dizzy that she sank down in the ditch with her legs twisted under her. I wasn't there, so I can't say he didn't, the Misfit said. I wished I had been there, he said, hitting the ground with his fist. It ain't right that I wasn't there, because if I had been there, I would have known. Listen, lady, he said in a high voice, if I had been there, I would have known, and I wouldn't be like I am now. His voice seemed about to crack, and the grandmother's head cleared for an instant. She saw the man's face twisted close to her own, as if he were going to cry, and she murmured, Why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children. She reached out and touched him on the shoulder. The Misfit sprang back as if a snake had bitten him, and shot her 3 times through the chest. Then he put his gun down on the ground and took off his glasses and began to clean them.
Okay, a lot happened here. And would it surprise you if I said it was a happy ending? Well, for the grandmother anyway. The Misfit seems to be in some anguish, and he's vulnerable. And it is in this moment that the grandmother's head cleared for an instant. Her head has never been clear, not until this moment. So what does she now understand? Probably for the first time in her life, she abandons her sentimental vanity, and she sees her connection to another human being. Although she has only one son, she sees the Misfit as one of her children, for whom she is responsible. She sees their shared humanity, sinners in need of grace. Now let's not forget that he just murdered her whole family. She's quite literally loving her enemy. She says, Why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children. She reaches out and touched him on the shoulder. Being good is going to cost you. Oscar Wilde said, A sentimentalist is simply one who wants to have the luxury of an emotion without paying for it. Well, the grandmother paid for it this time. When she was living up to her silly superficial standard of goodness, that cost her nothing. Extending the hand of love to her enemy would cost her her life. O'Connor once said, I have found that violence is strangely capable of returning my characters to reality and preparing them to accept their moments of grace. The grandmother accepted her moment of grace. Notice that the Misfit, too, is being offered grace here. He, too, is being asked, what will you do with Jesus? For now, the Misfit rejects Jesus and his gift. The Misfit sprang back as if a snake had bitten him, and he shot her 3 times through the chest.
Hiram and Bobby Lee returned from the woods and stood over the ditch looking down at the grandmother, who half sat and half lay in a puddle of blood. with her legs crossed under her like a child's and her face smiling up at the cloudless sky. Without his glasses, the Misfit's eyes were red-rimmed and pale and defenseless looking. "Take her off and throw her where you thrown the others," he said, picking up the cat that was rubbing against his leg. "She was a talker, wasn't she?" Bobby Lee said, sliding down into the ditch with a yodel. "She would have been a good woman," the Misfit said, "if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life." "Some fun," Bobby Lee said. "Shut up, Bobby Lee," the Misfit said. "It's no real pleasure in life."
So the grandmother is dead, and our first impulse is to regard this as tragic. But there are more things in heaven and on earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in our philosophy. Look at how she's described while she lies dead in the ditch. Not as a lady, as she had planned. The grandmother who half sat and half lay in a puddle of blood, with her legs crossed under her like a child's and her face smiling up at the cloudless sky. That little simile, like a child, that's an allusion to Matthew 18 verse 3, when Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." What is this saying of the grandmother? When she reached out to the Misfit and called him her child, she had been changed. She had become like a little child. The description of the corpse tells us so. And then there's that cloudless sky again. So it's gotten to mean something with all that repetition. In her death, the grandmother is looking upward, smiling. She's looking upward toward heaven. The sky is open to her. It's clear of impediments. No clouds are symbolically blocking or hiding the way. This scene reminds me of the stoning of Stephen in Acts 7 verses 54 to 60. But I'm not sure if that's what O'Connor had in mind. Maybe. The grandmother had her moment of grace and accepted it. The Misfit says it best. "She would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life." It's interesting that the Misfit acknowledges the grandmother's final act as the action of a good woman. She's been calling people good people all through this story, but it didn't mean anything. There's only one good person who ever lived. That's why they're so hard to find. But in her last moments, the grandmother reflected Jesus' love for humanity, and so she is called good. What will you do with Jesus? There are two options. You will reject him or accept him. You will kill him or die with him. In this scene, we have two characters, one of each. And the last line of the story. Remember when the Misfit said that the only pleasure in life for him is meanness? Well, now he says that there's no pleasure in life, not even meanness. He just realized the inadequacy of his whole philosophy of life. Perhaps the story is not yet over for the Misfit. And what about the dead family? The children? Well, O'Connor suggests we just look past those and look at the movement of grace. That's what this story is about. And remember, it is just a story.